Something changed in the way your soulmate sees you, and it may have happened without you ever knowing they were watching. They recently discovered that the future you are building doesn't look anything like the future they once imagined for you. And that realization hit differently because somewhere in their mind, they were still carrying an older version of you. The version they remembered, the version whose dreams they thought they understood, the version they believed they could still predict. Then suddenly, they saw evidence that you had been moving in an entirely different direction. Maybe you've been rebuilding your life quietly, changing your priorities, working towards something bigger, becoming more independent, or simply creating a future that no longer revolves around what happened between you. And for a moment, your soulmate may have felt completely caught off guard. They may have thought, when did all of this happen? Because while they were looking at the past, you were preparing for something they couldn't see. Imagine watching a train station from a distance, assuming the same train is still waiting on the same platform, only to discover that the train has already left and the entire schedule has changed. That's the feeling they may be experiencing now. They weren't necessarily expecting you to remain stuck, but somewhere inside, they assumed the connection between you would always leave a familiar door open. They may have imagined that if circumstances ever brought you back together, you would still be the same person they remembered. But now, they're seeing something different. You're not waiting for permission. You're not waiting for someone to return. You're not organizing your future around an old chapter. You're building forward, and that can create a strange mixture of emotions inside someone who still carries feelings they haven't completely understood. They may feel proud of you, curious about you, even genuinely happy to see you growing, but underneath that admiration could be a question they weren't prepared to ask. Where do I fit into this? Because your future suddenly looks like it has its own direction, its own purpose, its own momentum. And perhaps the most unsettling part for them is realizing that you built all of this without needing them to come back first. They may now be wondering how much you've changed, what you're planning next, and whether there is still any space for them in the life you're creating. But this is only the beginning, because the deeper they look at your transformation, the more they may realize that the person they thought they knew is no longer standing still. And that realization is about to force them to confront something much bigger than your new future. It is going to make them question whether they waited too long to become part of it. What they discovered about your future may have been surprising, but what unsettled them even more was realizing that the person building that future isn't the same person they remember. Somewhere along the way, you changed in ways they weren't there to witness. They may still have an old picture of you in their mind, emotionally frozen in the moment when the connection between you was strongest. But the reality they are seeing now doesn't match that picture anymore. And that difference can be powerful. Because when someone has been away from your life for a while, they often continue imagining you based on the last version of you they knew. They remember your old dreams, your old habits, your old insecurities, the things you wanted back then, maybe even the things you were willing to tolerate. They assume that if they ever returned, they could simply step back into the same emotional space. But now they're realizing that space may no longer exist in the same form. You have been changing the architecture of your life while they were still looking at the old blueprint. Imagine returning to a neighborhood you knew years ago and expecting to find the same streets, the same buildings, the same signs, only to discover that everything has been rebuilt. The roads are different. The houses have changed. The places you once recognized are gone. You still know where you are, but you can no longer navigate it using the old map. That may be exactly how your soulmate feels when they look at you now. They recognize you, but they don't completely understand the person standing in front of them. They may notice that you're more confident than before. Maybe you're more selective about who gets access to your energy. Maybe you no longer explain every decision. Maybe you stop chasing validation. Maybe your priorities have shifted from simply finding connection to creating stability, purpose, peace, and a future that feels genuinely yours. And those changes can make them wonder what happened while they weren't looking. They may ask themselves, when did they become this independent? Why don't they seem to need anyone to complete their life anymore? Would they even want the same things they wanted when we were together? These questions can be uncomfortable because they reveal something they may not have considered before. You didn't simply move forward in time. You evolved through it. Every disappointment, every difficult season, every quiet period, every moment when you had to make decisions alone contributed to the person they are seeing now. They may have missed all of those moments, and that can create a strange sense of distance. They know your history, but they don't know every chapter that happened after them. And suddenly they realize there is an entire version of you they never got to meet. That can create both curiosity and insecurity. They may genuinely admire your growth while wondering whether they still understand you well enough to approach you. Perhaps before, they knew what made you happy. They knew what upset you. They knew what you were afraid of. They knew what you wanted, but now they aren't so sure. And uncertainty changes everything. A person can feel comfortable approaching someone they believe they understand. But when that person becomes unpredictable in the healthiest sense, not because they're playing games, but because they've grown beyond old patterns, it creates hesitation. Your soulmate may now be wondering whether the things that once worked between you would still work today. Would the old conversations feel the same? Would the old chemistry still exist? Would you even respond to them the way you once did? Or would they meet a version of you who has completely different boundaries and expectations? And this is where your growth becomes emotionally significant. You may not have changed to make them notice. You may not have built your new future to prove anything. You simply reached a point where continuing to live according to an old version of yourself no longer made sense. Maybe you realized that you wanted more from life. Maybe you stopped accepting situations that drained you. Maybe you began taking your goals seriously. Maybe you learned how to enjoy your own company. Maybe you stopped looking for someone to rescue you from uncertainty because you discovered that you could create your own direction. And when your soulmate sees that, something inside them may shift. They may realize that the person they once thought would always be emotionally available to the past is now deeply invested in the future. That doesn't necessarily mean you forgot them. It means your life didn't stop because the relationship changed. And that truth can be difficult for someone who secretly believed there would always be another opportunity. They may have assumed that time was on their side. They may have thought they could return whenever they were ready and find you standing somewhere near the same emotional doorway. But now that doorway looks different. You're not necessarily closing it. You're simply no longer standing there holding it open. Imagine someone leaving a garden and assuming the garden will remain exactly as they remember it. Years later they return and discover that the flowers have grown, the paths have changed, and an entirely new landscape has developed. The garden didn't grow to punish them. It grew because gardens do what living things do. They change. Your life is doing the same thing. And your soulmate may now be standing outside that new landscape, wondering whether there is still a path leading toward you. That question can bring up memories they thought they had already resolved. They may remember conversations where you talked about your dreams. They may remember things you wanted to accomplish. They may remember moments when you needed encouragement or support. And perhaps they are now realizing that you actually followed through on things they once thought were distant possibilities. That can create admiration, but it can also create regret. They may wonder whether they underestimated you, whether they took your potential for granted, whether they assumed you would always remain within the emotional boundaries they were comfortable with. And perhaps the most uncomfortable realization is that your growth may have changed the balance between you. Before, they may have felt like they had more emotional control because you were still hoping for something. Now they may sense that you are no longer waiting for an answer from them. You're creating your own answers. And that can make someone reconsider everything. They may not know where they belong in your future because they are finally realizing that your future does not require them to exist. If they want to be part of it, they cannot simply return as the person they used to be. They would have to meet the person you've become. They would have to understand your new priorities, respect your new boundaries, and recognize that the version of you they once knew has evolved. And that is why their discovery is affecting them more deeply than they expected. They're not simply watching you build a new life. They're realizing they may have missed an entire transformation. They may have missed the moments that made you stronger, the lessons that made you wiser, and the experiences that changed what you now expect from love and life. And somewhere inside, a question is beginning to become impossible to avoid. If they were still part of your life today, would they even recognize the person you've become? Because they are beginning to understand that the future you're building isn't waiting for the past to catch up. It's already moving forward. And for the first time, they may be wondering whether they can keep up. And now the question they cannot seem to escape is no longer about what you are building. It is about whether there is still a place for them inside it. That is a very different question, because your soulmate may have spent a long time thinking about the connection in terms of the past. What happened? What went wrong? What could have been different? What they should have said? What you might have felt? But seeing you create a completely different future forces their attention forward. Suddenly, they are not only remembering you, they are imagining you years from now, living a life they may not be part of, and that possibility can create an emotion they weren't prepared for. They may look at your progress and feel genuinely happy for you, but somewhere underneath that happiness could be a quiet ache. Because when someone sees you becoming everything you were capable of becoming, they may also start wondering what their place would be if they ever tried to return. They might ask themselves, would they even make room for me now? Would they want me in this new chapter? Or did I wait until their life no longer had a space that naturally belonged to me? And those questions can become surprisingly difficult to silence. Imagine standing outside a house you once knew by heart and looking through the window years later. The house is still recognizable, but everything inside has changed. The furniture is different. The rooms have been rearranged. New memories have been created. You can still remember where you used to sit, but you aren't sure whether anyone would invite you inside anymore. That may be how your soulmate feels about your life now. They know they once had a place there emotionally, but they aren't sure whether that place still exists. And what makes it more complicated is that you may not have done anything to push them away. You simply kept living. You kept growing. You kept making decisions. You kept becoming more certain about what you want. That's why their uncertainty may feel so strong. If you had stayed stuck, they could have assumed the door was still waiting for them. But you didn't stay stuck. You changed the entire landscape. And now they have to confront the possibility that the future you are building might continue perfectly well without them. That realization can awaken feelings that were easier to ignore when they believed you would always remain emotionally available. They may begin comparing the person they are today with the person they would need to become to fit into your future. And that comparison can be uncomfortable. Maybe they once thought love was enough. Maybe they assumed chemistry could overcome everything. Maybe they believed that if two people cared about each other, the rest would eventually work itself out. But your growth may be teaching them something different. Love may need timing. It may need consistency. It may need emotional maturity. It may need two people who are actually prepared to build something instead of simply feeling something. And now they may be wondering whether they are ready for the version of you that exists today. Perhaps they remember how easy it once was to reach you. A message could change your entire mood. A conversation could pull you back into the connection. Their attention may have carried more weight than they realized. But now they sense something has changed. Your entire emotional center may no longer revolve around whether they show up. And that doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you stopped making your life dependent on someone else's decision. There is a difference, and your soulmate may be noticing it. Imagine holding a key to a door for years, believing the door will always open whenever you decide to use it. Then one day, you return and discover that the building has been renovated. The key may still mean something, but you can no longer assume it works. You have to knock. You have to be invited. You have to find out whether you still belong there. That may be the emotional position your soulmate finds themselves in now. They may still have memories. They may still have feelings. They may still carry affection for you, but none of those things automatically guarantee them a place in your future. And realizing that can create a strange mixture of longing and fear. They may wonder whether you have someone else in your life, whether your future already includes another person, whether your dreams have expanded beyond anything they could have imagined, whether the life you are creating is so different that there would be no natural place for the relationship you once shared. And perhaps the most painful thought is this: what if you have become so fulfilled on your own that you no longer need the connection they once assumed you would always want? That question can cause someone to revisit memories they had deliberately placed aside. They may remember your patience, your kindness, the way you believed in them, the moments they could have been more honest, the times they pulled away when they should have moved closer. And now, seeing you move forward, those memories may feel different. What once looked like ordinary moments may suddenly look like missed opportunities. They may wonder whether they recognized your value too late. But here's what makes this moment powerful. You don't have to chase them for them to experience that realization. You don't have to send a message. You don't have to announce your transformation. Your life itself is communicating something. It is saying that you are no longer waiting for someone else to decide what your future should look like. And perhaps that is exactly why your soulmate is thinking about where they fit. Because before, they may have assumed your future was something that could eventually be negotiated between the two of you. Now they are realizing that you have already started writing it. They aren't holding the pen anymore. You are. And if they want to become part of that story, they may eventually have to approach you differently. Not as the person who remembers who you used to be, but as someone willing to understand who you are now. That can be intimidating because it requires honesty. It requires them to admit that time changed both of you. It requires them to acknowledge that the old dynamic cannot simply be recreated. They cannot walk into your new life expecting everything to feel exactly as it did before. Too much has happened. Too much has been learned. Too much has changed. And maybe they are beginning to understand that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Perhaps the question isn't whether they can return to the old relationship. Perhaps the real question is whether something new could ever be created between two people who have grown beyond who they used to be. That is where their thoughts may be heading now. Not simply, do I still have feelings, but could I actually belong in the future this person is building? And the answer may not be obvious yet. They may need time to understand what they truly want. They may be watching quietly, trying to understand the direction of your life before deciding whether to step closer. But one thing has changed. They can no longer comfortably imagine you as someone frozen in the past. They are seeing you as someone with momentum, purpose, and a future that keeps unfolding. And somewhere inside them, that realization is creating a quiet urgency. Because the longer they watch you move forward, the more they may wonder whether the opportunity they once assumed would always exist is slowly becoming something they can no longer take for granted. And this is where everything becomes much more real for your soulmate, because they are finally beginning to understand that your future will continue whether they decide where they fit into it or not. For a long time, they may have unconsciously believed there would always be another opportunity, another conversation, another moment when the two of you could somehow return to what was left unfinished. But watching you build a completely different life changes that assumption. You are no longer standing at the same emotional crossroads, waiting for someone else to choose a direction. You are choosing your own, And that may be the part they find hardest to process. They can no longer look at your life and assume the past has permanent access to it. They may still remember everything you shared. They may still feel something when your name appears, when a familiar song plays, or when a memory suddenly returns. But memories don't automatically create a place in someone's future. Your soulmate may be realizing that now. Imagine a door that was once held open for them without them ever having to ask. They could walk toward it whenever they wanted because they assumed it would remain open. But eventually the person holding the door gets tired of standing there and continues walking. The door isn't necessarily locked. It simply isn't being held open anymore. That is the difference your soulmate may now be feeling. If they want to be part of your life, they may have to make an actual choice. They may have to step forward instead of simply wondering what could happen. And that can be frightening because wondering is safe. Action isn't. They may be able to sit quietly and imagine conversations with you, replay old memories, look at the direction your life is taking, and ask themselves whether there is still a possibility. But eventually, imagination reaches a point where reality demands an answer. Do I stay where I am, or do I finally move toward what I still feel? That question may be growing stronger inside them. But here's what has changed most. If they ever approach you again, they cannot approach the person you used to be. That person has already lived through everything that brought you here. You have learned from disappointment. You have developed stronger boundaries. You have become more intentional about what you want. You have started building a future that reflects your own values instead of simply fitting into someone else's expectations. And that means any future connection would have to respect the person you've become. They may be realizing that they can't simply return with old words and expect old doors to open. They would need to show consistency. They would need to understand your priorities. They would need to recognize that your life has momentum now. You are not waiting for someone to give your life meaning. You already have direction. That doesn't make love impossible. It makes love more intentional. And perhaps this is why their thoughts about you feel different now. Before, they may have wondered whether you still cared. Now they may be wondering whether they can still contribute something meaningful to your life. Before, they may have imagined you fitting into their world. Now they are realizing that if they want a place in your world, they have to understand the world you've built. That reversal can be humbling. It can force someone to look honestly at their own growth and ask whether they have changed enough to meet you where you are. Maybe they have. Maybe they haven't, but they can no longer avoid the question. And perhaps they are quietly comparing the person they are today with the person they would need to become to walk beside you. Imagine two roads that once traveled together, but eventually separated. Years later, one road has been expanded, strengthened, and carried forward into an entirely new landscape. The other person can still see where the roads once connected, but now they have to decide whether they are willing to build a new bridge. They cannot simply pretend the old road is still there. That may be the emotional reality your soulmate is facing. The old connection mattered, but the future cannot be built by recreating the past. If anything happens next, it would have to be something new, and that is both exciting and terrifying. They may wonder whether you would recognize their growth too. They may wonder whether you would trust them. They may wonder whether the timing has finally become right, or whether life has already taken you somewhere they can no longer reach. Those questions can create a strange silence. Sometimes people become quiet, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and don't yet know what to do with it. Your soulmate may be sitting with that uncertainty now. They may be watching from a distance, trying to understand whether the future you're creating has any opening for them. But there is something you should remember. You are not responsible for making that decision for them. Your job was never to pause your life until someone figured out what they wanted. Your job was to keep moving toward the life that felt right for you. And you did. That is why this moment matters. Your growth didn't happen to make someone regret losing you. It happened because you needed to become who you were capable of becoming. If your soulmate feels something because of that transformation, that belongs to their journey. If they begin questioning their choices, that belongs to them. If they eventually decide to step forward, that decision must come from them. You don't need to chase it into existence. You don't need to prove that you are worthy of being chosen. You are already building a life that has value with or without their participation. And perhaps that is the most unexpected part of this entire story. The person they thought they might eventually return to has become someone who no longer measures their future by who stays and who leaves. You have learned to ask a different question. Does this person genuinely belong in the life I'm creating? That is a powerful shift. It means the future is no longer about waiting for someone to decide your worth. It is about deciding who deserves to walk beside you. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate may be realizing that this is why they feel so uncertain now. They aren't simply trying to figure out whether they still have feelings. They are trying to figure out whether they can meet the standard of the future you are creating. Maybe that future eventually includes them. Maybe it takes a completely unexpected form. But either way, the decision cannot be based solely on who you both used to be. It has to be based on who you are now. So let them wonder for a moment. Let them sit with the realization that your life kept moving. Let them understand that the person they once knew didn't disappear. You evolved. And if they truly want to find a place beside you, they will eventually understand that they cannot ask you to go backward. They have to be willing to walk forward. Because the real question was never whether you still had room for them in the past. The question is whether they can become part of the future you are creating now. And perhaps that is the question your soulmate has been quietly carrying since the moment they discovered just how different your life has become. They may not have the answer yet, but they are finally asking the right question. There is another layer to this that your soulmate may not have expected, because watching you build a different future doesn't only make them wonder where they fit. It makes them confront what they never decided about you when they still had the chance. For a long time, it may have been easier for them to leave certain feelings unanswered. Maybe they told themselves that there was plenty of time. Maybe they assumed circumstances would eventually bring you back into each other's lives. Maybe they believed that if the connection was truly meant to continue, nothing they did or failed to do could change the outcome. But now your life is moving in a direction they didn't anticipate, and suddenly that comfortable assumption doesn't feel so safe anymore. They are beginning to understand that life doesn't always wait for people to become certain. Sometimes opportunities pass while someone is still thinking. Sometimes a person changes while someone else is still deciding what they feel. And sometimes the biggest realization comes only after the other person has stopped waiting for an answer. That may be what is happening inside your soulmate now. They aren't simply looking at your future. They are looking backward at themselves and asking difficult questions about the choices they made. Imagine standing at a crossroads for years, staring at two roads and telling yourself you can choose later. Then one morning, you look up and realize one of the roads has completely changed direction. You can still choose, but you can no longer pretend that waiting had no consequences. That is the emotional space they may be entering. They may remember moments when you gave them opportunities to understand you better, moments when you were more open than you realized, moments when you quietly hoped they would recognize what was happening between you. Maybe they didn't understand the importance of those moments at the time. Maybe they were distracted by fear, pride, timing, or circumstances. But your growth can make those memories look different. Suddenly what seemed ordinary becomes meaningful. What seemed temporary starts looking like something they should have valued more carefully. And that can create regret without necessarily creating immediate action. They may not know what to do with that regret yet. They may wonder whether reaching out would disrupt the life you've built. They may wonder whether you would welcome them or simply see them as someone from another chapter. They may even fear that they have missed their moment completely. That fear can be surprisingly powerful because your new future gives them something they didn't have before, evidence that you are capable of moving forward without them. Before, they could imagine you were simply waiting, healing, thinking, or figuring things out. Now they are seeing movement, real movement. Your decisions are producing results. Your priorities are changing. Your confidence is growing. Your life is taking shape. And that can make the distance between your worlds suddenly feel much more real. Perhaps they are asking themselves, what if I had chosen differently? What if I had been more honest? What if I had stayed instead of pulling away? What if I had understood what this connection meant before everything changed? These questions don't necessarily mean they are ready to return, but they reveal something important. They are reconsidering the story they once told themselves about you. They may have believed that the connection simply faded naturally. Now they may be realizing that there were decisions involved, and some of those decisions were theirs. This is where admiration can become emotional tension. They may genuinely admire the person you've become, but that admiration can also remind them of what they lost access to. They see your independence and wonder whether they could have supported it. They see your confidence and remember when you doubted yourself. They see your new direction and wonder whether they could have walked beside you if they had understood the destination earlier. Imagine watching a sunrise from a distance after spending years convinced you had already seen the most beautiful part of the day. Then the light changes, the entire horizon opens, and suddenly you realize you were looking in the wrong direction. Your soulmate may be experiencing something similar emotionally. Their perception of you is changing because your current life is revealing qualities they may not have fully appreciated before. Maybe you were always capable of this. Maybe the potential was always there, but they weren't looking closely enough to recognize it. And now that they are looking, they cannot easily unsee it. That can lead to another uncomfortable realization. Perhaps they didn't lose you because the connection wasn't meaningful. Perhaps they lost access to you because they didn't know how to meet you at the level you needed. That distinction matters. It shifts the story away from simple heartbreak and toward growth. You may have needed certain things then that you understand more clearly now. They may have needed certain things too. Both of you may have matured through the distance. And now, if they ever imagine being part of your future, they have to consider whether they have changed enough as well. Because your new life cannot be built around an old dynamic. If they return carrying the same fears, habits, avoidance, or uncertainty, they may not fit into the life you're creating. Your future requires a different kind of relationship, one based on honesty, consistency, mutual effort, and emotional clarity. And perhaps that is exactly what makes them hesitate. They may be asking themselves whether they are capable of meeting you there. Not whether they still feel something, but whether they can actually build something. That's a much harder question. Feelings can survive distance. Building a future requires action. It requires two people willing to show up when things become uncomfortable. It requires choosing each other intentionally rather than assuming circumstances will eventually do it for you. Your soulmate may be realizing that now. They may understand that simply missing you doesn't give them a place in your future. Remembering you doesn't give them a place. Even loving you may not automatically give them a place. If they ever want to belong in the life you're building, they may have to become someone who can genuinely contribute to it. And perhaps that realization is quietly changing the way they see themselves. Your growth is forcing them to examine their own. Your direction is making them question theirs. Your courage to move forward is making them wonder where they have been standing still. That doesn't mean you are responsible for their transformation. You aren't. Your job was never to wait until they figured everything out. You simply kept becoming more yourself. And that may be the very thing that finally makes them understand what they once had in front of them. They may look at your future and realize that the greatest change isn't that you no longer need them. It's that you no longer need anyone to tell you where your life should go. And if they are going to be part of that future, they cannot expect you to turn around and rebuild the past. They would have to walk forward with you. They would have to meet you where you are. And that possibility may be the thought they are carrying quietly right now, because your future has become more than a collection of plans. It has become a mirror, and in that mirror, they are finally seeing not only who you have become, but everything they might have to confront within themselves if they ever want to find their way back to you.